This is Math Studies, Lesson 11.2, Finding Sides. So we need to use the trigonometric ratios from the previous lesson. That is, the sine of an angle is equal to the length of the side opposite from the angle divided by the hypotenuse of the triangle, or SOH, so for short. The cosine of an angle is equal to the length of the side adjacent to that angle divided by the length of the hypotenuse of the triangle, or CAHK. And then the last one was that the tangent of an angle is equal to the length of the side opposite of that angle divided by the length of the side adjacent to that angle, or TOA. And so for short, so, ka, TOA is our mnemonic device to help us remember that. Let's use these ratios then to try to figure out how long the sides are when I have a variable and unknown there. The first example has a 43-degree angle right there. So I'm going to label the sides of the triangle in relation to that 43-degree angle. Opposite 43 would be way at the bottom. Adjacent to 43 would be right next to it. And hypotenuse is always across from the right angle, so my hypotenuse is the longest one over there. So we practiced that last lesson. That should be okay. Now we're going to use that to choose one of the three trigonometric ratios based on where I have information. So I have a hypotenuse by x, I have an adjacent by a 20, and the opposite side of the triangle is blank. I don't know how long it is. I'm not trying to figure out how long it is, so I'm going to ignore the opposite side. And based on having the adjacent and the hypotenuse with some information, that's going to help me pick sine or cosine or tangent. So I can't write a sine fraction if I'm not working with the opposite. I can't write a tangent fraction because I need an opposite. So this one for sure is going to be a cosine. Cosine is the trig ratio that I can write with A and H. So that will be a cosine. And then we write cosine of the angle. So this is going to be cosine of 43 degrees equals, and the fraction we write is the adjacent on top and the hypotenuse on bottom. So I'm going to put the 20 on the top of my fraction, and I'm going to put the hypotenuse, the x, on the bottom of the fraction. So now the goal is to solve for x. And I feel like the easiest way to solve an equation with a fraction is to turn it into a proportion, and then we can cross multiply and divide. You can always write something over 1, so I added over 1 underneath my cosine 43, and it doesn't change the value of an expression because dividing by 1 doesn't do anything. So now that I have fraction equal fraction, it's much easier to do with my cross multiply and divide to get the answer that I'm looking for x. So on my calculator, I need to make sure that I am in degree mode. If you have a calculator that has the option between degree and radian mode, make sure you're in degree mode. If you're using one of my little blue calculators, they default to degree. If you're using a TI 83 or 84, they default to radian. So I'm in degree mode for sure, so I'm good to go. I'm going to start with the 20, the top of that fraction. I'm going to multiply by 1. Which really doesn't do anything because times by 1, that was my invisible one that I added just to make sure I'm getting my times and divide direction correct. But then I'm going to do 20 times 1, and then I'm going to divide by, and I'm not dividing by 43. I'm dividing by the cosine of 43, right? 20 times 1 divided by the cosine of 43 to get to my answer. So now we're going to make sure we're using those sine, cosine, tangent buttons, which are here, here, and here. Just wanted to show you where they were. But I'm going to get rid of them now. 20 times 1 divided by the cosine of 43. And because I'm in degree mode, that will then calculate how long the hypotenuse is of this triangle. And it looks like it is 27.3 centimeters. And that makes sense if I think about it because this is 20. hypotenuse definitely needs to be longer than that. If I ended up with something smaller than 20, I know something didn't go right. Maybe I set my fraction up wrong, or I chose the wrong sine, cosine, tangent. So looking for the reasonableness, 27, that seems about 7-ish longer than the side I had labeled for the adjacent. So I like it. Moving on to letter B. We're going to start by labeling A, H, and O. H is the easiest one, I think, to do first, the longest side across from the right angle. I have a 65-degree angle marked up top, so the opposite is going to be the farthest one from that, and the adjacent is the closest one to that. After we label A, H, and O, we are going to choose sine or cosine or tangent based on the information that I have labeled. I have an H, I have an O, my A is blank. So I can't write a fraction where I need to know the adjacent. I have to do the O and the H, and in this case that is sine. So sine of the angle, and I'm going to go ahead and stick that right over 1 because that's going to help me cross multiply and divide later. My fraction will be the opposite, in this case that was by the 10, over the hypotenuse, and that was by the x. So I will cross multiply and divide 10 times 1, which is still 10, but then divided by the sine of 65. Going to my calculator. That is 10 times 1. Don't really need that, but I like including it just in case you struggle with how to solve for a ratio. That looks better. And I get 11, which again, a little longer than the opposite side. That seems like a reasonable answer to me. X equals 11.0. And I don't have any units on this one, so I'm going to just write units. It should say inches or centimeters or something, but 11.0 units. Moving to letter C. Same deal. Letter D, same deal. We're just going to do a couple more to practice. We're going to start by labeling A, H, and O. So my hypotenuse is way over here, the longest side of the triangle. My 25 degrees is actually inside this corner. So that means my opposite would be way at the top, and my adjacent will be the closest one to the 25 degrees. Now this one looks like we have the hypotenuse, we have the adjacent, we have the opposite, but we actually don't have the hypotenuse because that arrow is bringing that 25 degrees into that angle. The hypotenuse is the blank side. That's the one we're going to ignore. So I like the O, I like the A because I have a letter or a number at each of those. The H is blank, we ignore the blank one. O and A. If I look back to my SOHCAHTOA, TOA would be T for tangent. So the tangent of the angle over 1 is the opposite over the adjacent. TOA. O on top, A on bottom. So that's going to be O is 12 and A is X, and we again cross multiply and divide. That becomes 12 times 1 divided by the tangent of 25. And I can quick crank that one out, making sure that we're using the tangent button in degree mode, and I get 25.7. We'll go units again. Oh, inches, my bad. Inches. And the last one, A, H, and O. H is across from the right angle. Opposite is across from the 55 degrees. Adjacent is the closest to the 55 degrees. The H has a 20. The A has an X. The O is blank. A and H are telling me to choose cosine. So CAHTOA. The cosine of 55 degrees. Ka is C-A-H, so I need the A on top, and I need the H on bottom. So the first 3 examples all put X on the bottom, but that doesn't mean X is always on the bottom. The way that we set up the fraction is based on the SOHCAHTOA. So the sine, the hypotenuse should go on the bottom. The cosine, the hypotenuse should go on the bottom. And in this example versus part A, because my x was on the adjacent. That's why the x went on top. Whereas way over here, my x was the hypotenuse. That's why the x went on the bottom. So the hypotenuse goes on the bottom, the x goes on the bottom, the 20 goes on the bottom, not the adjacent. Once it's set up, we do the same deal. And that's why this over 1 helps us make sure that we're multiplying and dividing in the right direction. So here we're going to multiply what we know diagonal. We're going to multiply 20 times the cosine of 55 divided by 1, and that brings us to our answer. I'm going to write it out. 20 times the cosine of 55 divided by 1. And that divide by 1 is kind of an extra thing we don't really need. It just helps us remember to go in the right direction. So 20 times the cosine of 55. Throw in that divide by 1 just for fun. And I get 11.5. $11.5 units. That's it. Good luck on the exercises. Let me know if you have any questions.